Imagine finding a newborn fawn, still wet from birth, abandoned in the forest with no mother in sight. You take her home, bottle feed her every 3 hours for months, nurse her back to strength, and then do the hardest thing, release her back into the wild where she belongs, knowing you'll probably never see her again. That's exactly what happened to a man named Thomas Mitchell in the forests of northern Wisconsin. But 6 years later, on the first crisp morning of autumn, something impossible walked out of those same woods. A massive 10-point buck, weighing over 300 pounds, who walked straight to the exact spot where Thomas had released that tiny fawn years ago and waited. Not once, not twice, but every single autumn for 6 years and counting, this wild buck returns to the same clearing at the same time of year to the man who saved his life when he was just hours old. This is a story about memory that defies what we think we know about deer cognition, loyalty that transcends the wild instinct to flee from humans, and a bond forged in vulnerability that 6 years of forest life couldn't erase. Hey, amazing community! Before we dive into this absolutely incredible journey, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing our Animal Hero Moments family spanning every corner of the world. And if stories about animal memory, the bonds that survive years of separation, and the moments when wild creatures choose connection over instinct move you deeply, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Every single subscriber helps us share these powerful stories that prove memory, gratitude, and loyalty exist in forms we're only beginning to understand. Stay until the very end. This journey will change how you see wild animals and the invisible threads that connect us across species boundaries. It was May 2017 in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin, a vast 1.5 million acre wilderness of mixed hardwood forests, wetlands, and pristine lakes stretching across the state's Northwoods region. Thomas Mitchell, a 52-year-old conservation officer with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, was conducting a routine spring patrol along Forest Service roads when he noticed something unusual. Fresh tracks indicating a doe had given birth recently, but the tracks showed the mother moving away from the birth site rather than staying to protect her newborn, highly abnormal behavior for white-tailed deer. Following the tracks to investigate, Thomas discovered a heartbreaking scene. A newborn fawn, still covered in birth fluid and unable to stand, lying in tall grass approximately 50 yards from where the umbilical cord remnants suggested she'd been born. The mother was nowhere in sight, and based on the temperature of the fawn's body and the dried condition of the birth site, Thomas estimated the baby had been alone for at least 4 to 6 hours, long enough that her survival was now in serious question without immediate intervention. White-tailed deer fawns are among the most vulnerable newborns in North American wildlife, born with virtually no ability to regulate their body temperature, unable to walk for the first several hours, and completely dependent on their mother's milk for survival. In normal circumstances, does hide their fawns in secure locations and return every few hours to nurse, with the fawn's spotted coat and natural lack of scent providing camouflage from predators. But when a doe abandons her fawn, whether due to injury, predator pressure, or sensing something wrong with the baby, that fawn's survival odds drop to near zero within 24 hours from hypothermia, dehydration, or predation. Thomas faced the classic wildlife officer's dilemma: intervene in a natural process, potentially habituating a wild animal to humans and compromising its future survival, or follow the non-interference protocol and allow nature to take its course, even when that course leads to certain death. His training was clear: wild animals should be left alone except in cases where human activity caused the problem. But something about this fawn, shivering in the morning cold, barely strong enough to lift her head, made Thomas deviate from protocol. He made the decision to intervene, carefully lifting the fawn, who weighed less than 6 pounds and fit easily in his arms, and transporting her to his truck. The drive to his rural property outside the town of Eagle River took 40 minutes, during which Thomas called Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a wildlife veterinarian he'd worked with on previous cases, to get immediate guidance on emergency fawn care. Her instructions were specific: body temperature stabilization first, then hydration, then specialized formula feeding, following strict protocols to prevent aspiration pneumonia and digestive issues that kill many hand-raised fawns. Thomas's wife Rebecca, initially shocked when her husband arrived home with a newborn deer, quickly became the fawn's primary caregiver during daylight hours while Thomas worked. They set up a temperature-controlled space in their garage, used heating pads and blankets to bring the fawn's body temperature back to normal range, and began the exhausting process of bottle feeding every 2 to 3 hours around the clock with goat's milk formula that most closely approximates deer milk composition. The first 48 hours were critical and uncertain. The fawn, whom Rebecca named Willow because of her delicate willowy legs, struggled with feeding initially, requiring patient coaxing to accept the bottle's artificial nipple. She showed signs of dehydration and weakness that suggested she might not survive despite their efforts. But on the third day, something shifted. Willow began feeding eagerly, her body temperature stabilized, and she attempted her first wobbly steps, the natural progression that should have occurred within hours of birth, but had been delayed by her abandonment and initial decline. Over the following weeks, Willow's personality emerged. She was curious, gentle, and remarkably trusting of Thomas and Rebecca, following them around the property when they let her out for supervised outdoor time, bedding down beside them when they sat outside and vocalizing softly, the bleating sounds fawns make when seeking their mothers whenever they were out of her sight. The Mitchells were careful not to overhandle her, understanding that she needed to develop natural wariness of humans if she was ever going to survive in the wild. But the reality was unavoidable. Willow had imprinted on them as her family, her safe place, her entire known world. By late July, Willow had grown into a healthy juvenile fawn weighing approximately 45 pounds, capable of running at impressive speeds, browsing on vegetation independently, and showing all the physical signs of readiness for wild living. But her psychological readiness was another matter entirely. She showed no fear of humans, would approach strangers visiting the Mitchell property with curious confidence, and seemed to have no concept that she was a deer rather than an unusual member of the Mitchell household. Dr. Hendricks visited in early August to assess Willow's condition and provide guidance on the release process. Her evaluation was blunt. Physically, she's perfect. Behaviorally, she's problematic. She's habituated to humans in ways that could get her killed, either approaching hunters who won't recognize her as the hand-raised fawn you've cared for, or failing to flee from predators because she doesn't understand humans as potential threats. You need to release her soon, before hunting season begins in September, and you need to accept that her survival odds are lower than they would be for a wild-raised fawn. The decision to release Willow was agonizing for Rebecca, who had spent 3 months waking every few hours for feedings, spending entire days ensuring the fawn's safety, and developing what she freely admitted was a maternal bond with this delicate creature who trusted her completely. But Thomas, with his professional understanding of wildlife management, knew that keeping Willow permanently would transform her from a wild deer into a captive pet, a violation of both wildlife regulations and the animal's right to live as her species evolved to live. They chose a release site carefully, a clearing approximately 3 miles from their property, deep enough into national forest land that Willow would be away from roads and human development, but with abundant browse, water sources, and known deer populations that she might eventually integrate with. The location, marked by a distinctive lightning-struck oak tree at the clearing's edge, would become significant in ways Thomas couldn't predict. On August 15, 2017, Thomas and Rebecca brought Willow to the clearing in a specialized wildlife transport crate. The release was designed to be quick and clean, no prolonged goodbyes that might confuse the fawn about whether she was being abandoned again. They opened the crate. Willow stepped out into the clearing, and for a long moment she simply stood there, looking back at Thomas and Rebecca with those large, dark eyes that seemed to hold far more awareness than a deer's eyes should contain. Then, with an instinct that must have been buried beneath months of domestication, Willow turned and bounded into the forest, her white tail flashing in the sunlight filtering through the canopy. Thomas and Rebecca stood in that clearing for nearly an hour afterward, hoping to catch one more glimpse, knowing they were doing the right thing but feeling the profound loss of a being they'd saved, raised, and loved. The following weeks were difficult for Rebecca, who found herself listening for the soft bleating sounds that had filled their home for 3 months, checking the garage automatically before remembering that Willow was gone. Thomas, more accustomed to the professional distance required in wildlife work, still found himself thinking about the Fawn during forest patrols, wondering if she'd survived her first weeks alone, if she'd found other deer, if their intervention had ultimately helped or harmed her chances. As autumn arrived in late September, painting the northern Wisconsin forests in brilliant oranges and reds, Thomas occasionally returned to the clearing where they'd released Willow, partly for work-related reasons. The area was part of his patrol territory, but partly hoping for some sign that she'd survived. He found deer tracks, evidence of browsing on vegetation, but nothing definitive that would identify one specific deer among the hundreds that ranged through that section of forest. Hunting season opened in November, and Thomas experienced something he'd never felt before in 2 decades as a conservation officer. Anxiety that some hunter might shoot a deer that showed no fear of humans, not knowing that her trust was earned through months of bottle feeding and care. He couldn't patrol every section of forest, couldn't protect one specific deer among thousands, but the worry gnawed at him nonetheless. Winter came, harsh and unforgiving as northern Wisconsin winters are, with temperatures dropping to 30 below zero and snow depths exceeding 3 feet. White-tailed deer survival rates plummet in severe winters, especially for young deer experiencing their first winter. Thomas tried not to calculate Willow's survival odds, tried not to imagine her struggling through blizzards without the herd knowledge of where to find browse under deep snow, where to shelter from killing winds. Spring 2018 arrived, with the gradual warming that transforms Wisconsin's northwoods from white silence to green renewal. Thomas had largely stopped thinking about Willow actively, though she remained a bittersweet memory that surfaced occasionally. Life moved forward. Work, home, the cycle of seasons that marks time in rural Wisconsin. The clearing where they'd released her remained part of his patrol route, but he'd stopped hoping to see her there. Then came September 23, 2018, the autumn equinox, that pivot point when summer yields to fall and the Northwoods forests begin their annual transformation. Thomas was conducting a routine morning patrol when something made him decide to check the clearing, now over a year since Willow's release. He parked his truck at the Forest Service Road entrance and walked the quarter-mile trail to the site, marked still by that distinctive lightning-struck oak. What he found in that clearing would defy everything he thought he knew about deer cognition, memory, and the capacity for recognition across species boundaries. A massive buck, probably 2.5 years old based on body size and antler development, standing approximately 30 yards from the lightning-struck oak, facing the direction from which Thomas was approaching. The deer wasn't fleeing, wasn't displaying the typical white-tailed deer alarm response of snorting, tail flagging, and bounding away. He was simply standing there, watching Thomas with what appeared to be expectation rather than fear. Thomas froze, recognizing immediately that this was highly abnormal behavior. Mature bucks, especially during early autumn when they're beginning to establish dominance for the approaching rut, are typically the most skittish deer in the forest, fleeing at the first hint of human presence. But this buck remained stationary, his head high, his body language alert but not alarmed, watching Thomas with an intensity that felt like recognition rather than mere caution. Then the buck did something that made Thomas's breath catch. He took several deliberate steps toward Thomas, closing the distance to approximately 20 yards, well within what wildlife biologists call the flight initiation distance for wild white-tailed deer, the invisible boundary that, when crossed, triggers immediate escape behavior. The buck stopped, made a soft vocalization, not the aggressive grunt snort of a challenging male, but a sound Thomas had heard before, the contact call that fawns make seeking their mothers. In that moment, Thomas saw what he'd been too focused on the buck's impressive size to notice initially: a distinctive mark on the deer's left front shoulder, a patch of fur growing in white rather than brown, creating a small irregular star pattern. It was a marking Thomas recognized because he'd noticed it when Willow was a fawn, a unique identifier that wildlife biologists call a piebald marking, rare but permanent genetic variations in coat color. "Willow," Thomas said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, feeling foolish for talking to a wild deer but unable to stop himself. "Is that you?" The buck's ears swiveled forward, focusing on Thomas's voice. He took another step closer, now less than 15 yards away, well within the distance where any normal wild buck would have bolted. His nostrils flared, scenting the air, processing the information carried on the wind. And then, in a gesture that Thomas would replay in his mind thousands of times in the years that followed, the buck lowered his head, not in aggression, not in submission, but in a posture that Thomas recognized from Willow's fawn days, the way she would lower her head to nuzzle against his hand when seeking reassurance or comfort. Thomas stood absolutely still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any action might break whatever spell had brought this wild buck to stand calmly in front of the human who had bottle-fed him as an orphaned fawn over a year ago. They remained like that for perhaps 3 minutes, an eternity in wildlife encounter terms, the man and the deer simply acknowledging each other's presence across a species boundary that should have been uncrossable. Then, with the same unhurried deliberation with which he'd approached, the buck turned and walked back into the forest, pausing once at the tree line to look back before disappearing into the golden autumn foliage. Thomas remained in the clearing for another hour, trying to process what had just happened, trying to convince himself it wasn't wishful thinking or coincidence, trying to understand how a wild deer could possibly remember a human scent after over a year of forest living. Thomas returned to that clearing the next morning, and the morning after, driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and emotional hope he couldn't quite articulate. The buck didn't appear again during those visits, and Thomas began to doubt his initial interpretation. Perhaps it had been a different deer. Perhaps the piebald marking was less distinctive than he remembered. Perhaps he'd seen what he wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. But exactly 1 year later, on September 22nd, 2019, again during the week of the autumn equinox, Thomas made his routine check of the clearing and found the same buck waiting. Now, a mature 5-year-old with a magnificent 10-point rack, the deer stood in almost the exact same position as the previous year, displaying the same calm acceptance of Thomas's presence, the same deliberate approach to within 15 yards, the same soft vocalization, and the same distinctive lowering of his head in that gesture of recognition. This time Thomas was prepared. He'd brought his department-issued camera and managed to capture several photographs and a brief video of the encounter, documenting the buck's unusually calm behavior, the distinctive piebald marking on his shoulder, and the apparent recognition response. He also noted specific details. The encounter occurred within a 3-day window of the autumn equinox, always in morning hours between 7:30 and 8:30 a.m., always in the same clearing, and always with the same behavioral pattern from the buck. Dr. Hendricks, reviewing Thomas's photographic evidence, confirmed that the piebald marking matched her records from Willow's veterinary examination as a fawn. The probability of 2 deer with that exact marking pattern in that exact location, displaying that exact behavior toward you specifically, is essentially 0, she stated. This is Willow, and somehow he, has been remembering you and actively returning to this location at the same time each year. Rebecca, learning of the encounters, was both thrilled and heartbroken. He survived, she said, tears streaming down her face as she watched Thomas's video of the 2019 encounter. Our baby survived the winter, survived hunters, survived everything, and he's come back to say thank you. How is that possible? How do deer do that? The scientific literature on white-tailed deer cognition and memory provided partial answers. Deer possess excellent spatial memory, capable of remembering the locations of food sources, water, bedding areas, and escape routes across territories spanning several square miles. They recognize individual deer by scent, appearance, and behavior, maintaining social bonds that can last years. Mother-offspring recognition persists into adulthood, with does and their daughters often maintaining proximity throughout their lives. But what the literature didn't adequately explain was cross-species memory, the apparent ability of this deer to remember and recognize a human individual after years of separation, and to actively seek out that human at a specific location and time. Dr. Marcus Feldman, a deer behavior researcher at the University of Wisconsin, after reviewing Thomas's documentation, stated, "We've known for years that deer are more cognitively sophisticated than popular culture suggests. But this case suggests their memory capabilities, particularly olfactory memory, may rival or exceed those of domestic dogs. This buck is demonstrating intentional behavior, returning to a specific place at a specific time, apparently seeking a specific individual. That's not instinct. That's planning, memory, and arguably a form of gratitude." The 2020 encounter followed the same pattern. Late September, morning hours, the clearing, the calm approach, the lowered head. Thomas had shared his documentation with select colleagues in wildlife management, and several expressed interest in observing the 2020 encounter directly. But Thomas declined, feeling protective of what had become a deeply personal annual reunion. "This isn't a scientific specimen to study," he explained. "This is, I don't know what to call it. A relationship, a bond, something that matters to both of us apparently, and I won't turn it into a spectacle." The pattern held in 2021, 2022, and 2023. Each autumn, within days of the equinox, the buck, now a mature 6.5-year-old and one of the largest deer Thomas had ever seen in his professional career, would return to the clearing. The encounters never lasted long, usually 10-15 minutes, and they followed the same ritual. The buck's calm presence, the approach, the vocalization, the lowered head, the acknowledgement, then departure back into the forest. Thomas found himself structuring his patrol schedule around these encounters, ensuring he was available during the critical late September window. Rebecca occasionally accompanied him, watching from a distance as the buck who had been their bottle-fed fawn interacted with her husband in this annual ceremony of recognition and connection. "It's like he's checking in," she reflected after the 2022 encounter, making sure Thomas is still here, still okay, still remembering him the way he remembers Thomas. The annual reunions began attracting attention beyond Thomas's immediate circle, when a regional Wisconsin newspaper ran a story in October 2021 titled "The Buck Who Returns, a Conservation Officer's Unlikely Bond." The article, featuring several of Thomas's photographs, went viral within the hunting and conservation communities, generating thousands of comments and shares. Reactions split between wonder and skepticism, with some questioning whether the encounters were staged or misinterpreted, while others saw in them evidence of animal consciousness and emotional capacity that challenged conventional understanding. Wildlife biologists and cognitive researchers reached out requesting permission to study the phenomenon more systematically. Dr. Lori Marino, a neuroscientist specializing in animal cognition, proposed installing motion-activated cameras in the clearing to capture the full behavioral sequence without human presence, potentially influencing the buck's actions. Thomas reluctantly agreed to limited non-invasive observation, leading to fascinating documentation. The cameras captured the buck arriving at the clearing on September 19, 2022, a full 3 days before Thomas appeared, suggesting the deer was actively seeking the encounter rather than stumbling upon it by chance. The footage revealed additional behavioral details that supported the recognition hypothesis. The buck spent significant time investigating the area near the lightning-struck oak, scent marking specific locations, and exhibiting what deer behavior experts identify as search behavior, the pattern of movement and attention allocation that deer show when seeking specific individuals or resources. "This deer isn't just passing through familiar territory," Dr. Marino explained in her analysis. "He's actively waiting for something, and based on his subsequent behavior when Thomas arrives, that something is Thomas specifically." Educational institutions began incorporating the case into curricula about animal cognition and human-wildlife relationships. The story appeared in biology textbooks, environmental education programs, and wildlife management training as an example of the complex cognitive abilities present in species often dismissed as purely instinct-driven. Thomas received invitations to speak at conferences and universities, though he declined most, uncomfortable with the attention and preferring to keep the encounters private and unexamined beyond what seemed minimally necessary for documentation. The hunting community's response proved particularly interesting. Many hunters who had spent decades pursuing white-tailed deer expressed that Thomas's story changed their perception of their quarry. Online forums dedicated to deer hunting filled with discussions about deer intelligence, memory, and the ethical implications of hunting beings capable of such sophisticated social bonds. Some hunters reported feeling increased respect for deer as worthy opponents rather than simple targets, while others questioned whether hunting was ethical if deer possessed the emotional and cognitive capacities Thomas's buck demonstrated. Conservation organizations leveraged the story in fundraising and public education campaigns. The story became a powerful tool for advocating habitat protection, arguing that if deer possess such remarkable memory and attachment to specific locations, then preserving those locations becomes not just an ecological necessity, but an ethical obligation to beings whose lives are deeply connected to the landscapes they inhabit. Donations to Wisconsin wildlife conservation programs increased measurably in the months following the story's circulation, with many donors specifically citing the buck's story as motivation. Thomas's relationship with hunting evolved in ways he hadn't anticipated. As a conservation officer, he'd always supported regulated hunting as a necessary tool for managing deer populations and funding conservation through license fees and excise taxes. But personally, he found himself unable to hunt after his first reunion with Willow turned buck. "I can't look down a rifle scope at a deer and not see him," Thomas admitted in a 2023 interview. "I know intellectually that hunting is essential for population management in the absence of natural predators. But emotionally, I can't separate this one deer from all deer. They all might be someone's Willow. They all might remember someone who helped them once." The annual encounters also raised complex questions about wildlife habituation and the risks of human-wildlife interactions. Critics argued that Thomas's continued meetings with the buck could be teaching the deer to trust humans generally, a potentially fatal lesson if the buck approached other humans who might perceive him as a threat or a trophy. Wildlife management professionals debated whether Thomas should discontinue the encounters despite their apparent significance to both man and deer, arguing that the welfare of the individual animal needed to be balanced against broader concerns about maintaining appropriate wild animal wariness of humans. Dr. Hendricks, weighing in on these debates, offered a nuanced perspective. Willow's case is unique because the habituation occurred during the critical imprinting period as a newborn fawn. His trust of Thomas specifically doesn't appear to have generalized to humans broadly. He shows normal flight response to other people in the forest. What we're seeing is more analogous to how dogs recognize and trust specific humans while remaining wary of strangers. The cognitive sophistication required to maintain that discrimination is remarkable and suggests that our concerns about habituation may be oversimplified. The scientific papers emerging from the case focused on multiple dimensions of deer cognition, spatial memory and navigation, how the buck relocates the specific clearing annually, temporal memory, the consistent late September timing, individual recognition, distinguishing Thomas from other humans, and what researchers termed cross-species social memory, the apparent maintenance of a meaningful relationship with a member of another species across years of separation. Each paper added layers to understanding white-tailed deer as cognitively complex beings, whose inner lives were far richer than traditional wildlife management models acknowledged. September 2023 marked 6 years since Willow's release and the 6th consecutive autumn reunion. Thomas, now 58 years old and contemplating retirement within the next few years, found himself thinking about what would happen to these annual encounters when he was no longer able to make the hike to the clearing, or when the buck eventually reached the end of his natural lifespan. White-tailed bucks rarely survive beyond 8 to 10 years in the wild, meaning their time together was already finite and counting down. The 2023 encounter was particularly poignant. The buck, now showing slight signs of age, a small notch in one ear from an unknown altercation, slight graying around his muzzle, approached as always with calm recognition. But this year, he allowed Thomas to come closer than ever before, standing calmly as Thomas positioned himself within arm's reach. For a brief, breathtaking moment, Thomas extended his hand and the buck lowered his head, allowing Thomas to touch his forehead. the same way Thomas had stroked Willow's head during those early bottle-feeding days 6 years ago. "Thank you for surviving," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for coming back." Whether the buck understood the words or just the tone, he remained still for another moment before stepping back, completing their annual ritual and disappearing once more into the autumn forest. Rebecca, who had accompanied Thomas that year, captured the moment on video. Watching it later, she observed something profound. "You saved his life when he was hours old and completely helpless. And for 6 years, he's been coming back to remind you that it mattered, that he's alive because you chose to intervene, that the bond you formed when he was vulnerable didn't disappear when he became strong and wild. That's not just memory. That's gratitude. That's love in whatever form deer are capable of experiencing it." The broader implications of Willow's annual returns continued to ripple through conservation philosophy and wildlife management. The case became a touchstone for debates about individual animals versus populations, about the moral weight of individual animal experiences and relationships, and about whether conservation should focus solely on species preservation or also consider the welfare and dignity of individual beings who demonstrate clear evidence of consciousness, memory, and emotional capacity. Thomas began mentoring younger conservation officers, using his experience with Willow as a teaching tool about the complexity of wildlife management decisions. "The book says, 'Don't intervene,'" he would tell trainees, and usually that's right. But sometimes you have to make a decision that the book doesn't cover, that protocol doesn't address, that requires you to see an individual animal as a being with inherent value beyond their role in an ecosystem. I broke protocol to save Willow. And 6 years of annual reunions have taught me that animals remember kindness, that they form attachments, that they're capable of gratitude and loyalty we barely understand. In late 2023, Thomas was contacted by a documentary filmmaker interested in producing a short film about the annual reunions. After much consideration and consultation with wildlife experts, Thomas agreed on the condition that the buck's privacy and safety would be paramount. The resulting 15-minute documentary, titled The Buck Who Remembers, premiered at several environmental film festivals in early 2024, winning awards and reaching audiences far beyond the wildlife conservation community. The film sparked renewed discussions about human-wildlife coexistence, the cognitive abilities of game animals, and the ethical dimensions of hunting and wildlife management. Teachers showed it in classrooms, discussing questions like, do animals have rights based on their consciousness? How should we balance human uses of wildlife with recognition of animal sentience? What obligations do we have to individual animals who demonstrate clear evidence of sophisticated inner lives? For Thomas, the attention remained somewhat uncomfortable, though he appreciated that Willow's story was helping people see deer, and by extension, all wildlife, as more than resources to manage or obstacles to tolerate. Every deer in the forest might be capable of what Willow does, Thomas reflected in the documentary's closing scene. We just rarely create the circumstances where they can show us. Willow had the chance to demonstrate his memory, his recognition, his apparent gratitude because we formed a bond during his most vulnerable time. How many other animals carry similar capacities that we never witness because our relationship to them is predator, observer, or manager rather than caregiver? The documentary's final moments showed footage from the September 2023 encounter. The magnificent buck standing in golden autumn light, Thomas approaching with visible emotion, the gentle touch of hand to forehead, and the deer's calm acceptance of that contact. A text overlay noted, "The buck continues to return every autumn. Thomas continues to meet him there. Both are older now. Their time together is finite, but for 6 years and counting, they've proven that some bonds transcend species, that memory can bridge years of separation, and that gratitude, loyalty, and love exist in forms we're only beginning to understand." When asked what he hoped people would take from Willow's story, Thomas's answer was simple but profound. "I hope they'll see that the animals sharing our forests, fields, and world aren't simple creatures operating on instinct alone. They're individuals with memories, preferences, relationships, and inner lives as real as ours. Willow returns every autumn, not because he's programmed to, but because he chooses to. That choice, repeated year after year, tells us everything we need to know about who deer are, if we're willing to listen. Today, as autumn 2024 approaches, Thomas prepares for what will be the 7th annual reunion with the buck who was once a helpless fawn named Willow. The clearing in Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest waits, marked by its lightning-struck oak, a place that has become sacred through repetition. 7 autumns of a wild deer choosing to return, to remember, to acknowledge the human who gave him life when he had hours left to live. The pattern has become ritual. The ritual has become relationship. And the relationship has become proof that the boundaries we draw between human and animal consciousness are far more permeable than we imagined. Willow's annual returns have taught thousands of people that deer aren't simple prey animals operating on instinct. They're beings capable of sophisticated memory that spans years, recognition that crosses species boundaries, and what can only be called loyalty to those who showed them kindness in their darkest moments. Every person who watches the video of Thomas touching that buck's forehead, every hunter who pauses before taking a shot because they've thought about Willow's story, every child who learns that animals remember and relationships matter, they're all part of Willow's legacy, proof that one intervention, one choice to save a life, can ripple outward in ways we never predict. If you take one truth from Willow's journey, let it be this: memory is a form of love, and loyalty is a language that transcends words. That buck returns every autumn, not because he needs anything from Thomas. He's survived 6 winters, multiple hunting seasons, and all the dangers of wild living without human help. He returns because some part of him remembers being cold, alone, and dying until warm hands lifted him to safety. He returns because gratitude exists in deer hearts just as it exists in ours. And he returns to prove that the kindness we show to vulnerable beings doesn't disappear when they become strong. It echoes through years, carved into memory, as permanent as those antlers are temporary, as faithful as autumn's return, as true as the bond between a man and the wild buck who refuses to forget him.